Secrets Past, Infinity's End, Book 5, by Eric Warren. Narrated by Larry Gorman. 1. The ship resembled a gem in space. It wasn't more than a few thousand morbs away, but from the way Opais glinted off the surface and scattered the light rays, Vreej could have sworn it was a jewel. Until he flew the ship closer, that's how it had appeared. It wasn't like the Bulak ships. No, this was shiny, new, gleaming. It had damage, but that wasn't a problem for Vreej, not when he had all his tools. And they wouldn't mind a borrow. He'd borrowed many things. Everything came around again in the end. They were all connected, like the Great Ones used to say. The Great Ones had been back on Lak. Now Lak was lost. Vreej patted his eyes. Think on them later. Now it was time for work. Hard, quick work. He drove his small ship close to the jewel's surface, scanning for the parts he needed. It wouldn't take long. Then he'd be back on his way, gone in a flash. No traces. The scans looked very good. Many power conduits. They wouldn't miss them. He couldn't borrow them if they noticed. He couldn't leave them helpless. But this ship was powerful, strong, redundant. Vreej would borrow, then good fortune would come to them. They would see. They wouldn't even notice. Vreej's shuttle was much too small, much too camouflaged. Ah, Vreej smiled. The perfect spot for borrowing. It wouldn't take long at all. He stopped the shuttle less than 2 morbs from the side of the jewel. He removed one of the 12 identical canisters from his belt. Activating it sent shivers up his back. It was always the same. He grinned. Good sensations. Vreej grabbed his case of tools, and the open way yawned before him. He stepped through into the space. No gravity, no heat. Only cold and empty, like him. No, Vreej wasn't all cold. He was warm sometimes. He got to work cutting through the hard metal of the jewel. It was thicker than he'd thought, took longer to cut. He checked the field holding in his heat, holding in his air. Less than a quarter gone so far. He still had time. The panel came away, and Vreej aimed it for the opening in his shuttle, pushing it until it went inside. No waste. Everything can be reused. That's what they said back home. Couldn't afford waste, no matter what. That was okay with Vreej. Waste was bad anyway. This is it. Vreej liked talking to himself, kept himself company all the time. Today was no different. Behind the thick metal were 2 power converters and a distribution node. Perfect. His was almost deceased. The borrowed pieces would work great, with some modification. He removed the first canister, humming a tune Mother had taught him. Vreej didn't know the words, but that didn't matter. Humming was good enough today, even if all he could feel were the vibrations in his own ears. The first converter came out easy. No alarms. See? Easy to borrow. No one would notice. He clipped the first converter to his belt. Too fragile to throw back into the shuttle. He'd take them both at the same time. He just had to be careful. No one else was careful. Everyone else tried to shoot the jewel. Stupid. Nothing but a waste of energy. Energy they didn't have. But this would guarantee Vreej didn't run out of power for a while. It had been a long time since a borrow this good. He couldn't wait to get back home. Something sharp poked him between the shoulders. Vreej furrowed his brow. What? When he turned, he saw their great transparent bulbed heads, and he screamed, flailing his arms back, which only made him rotate. Stupid. He should have tethered on. What were these things? Their bodies were made of wrinkly material that was thick and fully opaque, except the heads. Inside the great bulbs were smaller heads. Vreej screamed again, the sound lost to space. He motioned himself away, but without anything to grab onto, he couldn't move. Wait, the jewel. Yes, he just... One of them grabbed him with its swollen hand. Vreej tried to fight back until another one hooked onto him as well. How were they moving? They had jets on their backs? Impossible. But wait, no. These were not their true forms. These were suits. The smaller animals must be inside. That's what he saw inside the bulb. That was the true animal. But still, the animal held a weapon pointed right at him. And canister or not, he didn't want to test their weapons. If they had a ship of this size, they could probably defend it well. Stupid. He should have been better, more careful. The lead animal motioned for him and the others to follow, to a shuttle like Vreej's a few morbs away. How had he missed it? They'd snuck up on him, and he hadn't even seen them. Too impressed with himself, too happy about the jewel. The converter still hung from his belt, bouncing back and forth as he pulled him along. He could detonate it, get them off him. But it would probably kill them all. And Vreej wasn't about to be killed. Not when there was more borrowing to do. They pulled him in the back of their craft, leading him in with their jets until the gravity took over. He was glad they had gravity. Some animals had nothing, just let themselves float in the emptiness. Vreej only liked floating sometimes. He checked his protection unit. He was only about halfway through its use, but he deactivated it anyway. No sense in wasting it. The first thing that hit him was the smell, and Vreej almost lost his last meal all over the alien ship's floor. It was a tangy, pungent smell, and Vreej didn't like it. Like the sickness of death or very bad food. Was this the animal's smell? He gagged as the animals removed the bulbs from their heads. Underneath were nothing but small heads, with something on the top. Like a mane. But it was longer on some of them than on others, and different colors. Vreej felt along his own smooth head. Manes were annoying. The lead animal said something, but it was gibberish. Vreej crossed his hands in front of his chest, the universal symbol for "I don't understand." The animal looked to the others and mimicked the movement. It didn't understand either? Or was it just copying? Ugh, animals. Vreej reached for something on his belt. All the animals shouted at once, pointing their weapons at him, and Vreej froze. He could understand that at least. He was only going for the translator. How were they supposed to understand Vreej if all they did was shout at him? No movement for Vreej, not until the animals calmed down. The lead one shouted something again. Didn't they understand? Vreej pointed to the small device on his belt, then his mouth. The lead animal's eyes flicked from the translator to Vreej and back again, all behind the raised weapon. Vreej sighed. Maybe the jewel wasn't so pretty after all. The shuttle bumped as it entered the ship. They were taking him. Not good, but not surprising. Vreej had seen ships. Many jails. Fewer lately, but always jail. With its weapon still on him, one of the animals reached over and unclipped the power converter from Vreej's belt, stowing it away. Vreej only hoped they had no torture. Torture was the worst. He pointed to the translator again, then again to his mouth, where he opened and closed it, making sounds. The animal's eyes got bigger. They were also soft-looking, like he could puncture them if he tried hard enough. Beneath the suits they had no kind of protection. No scales, shells, plates, nothing. Just soft and squishy. Did they always wear the suits? He had questions. Vreej made a motion for the translator again. Slow this time. The animals liked slow. Not fast, not jerky. The lead animal moved its head up and down. Was that good? Or was it a warning? Only one way to tell. Vreej took the translator off his belt, slow, very slow, then pressed it to his neck where it stuck. He motioned for the animals to begin speech, but they only stood silent. Vreej stared at the ceiling of the shuttle. They'd landed in the jewel, but hadn't moved yet. No one would leave until they could talk. "Long day," Vreej said. his bones tired under his muscles. Supposed to be an easy borrow, not all this mess. The lead animal cocked its head. Did they have translators too? Did all he need to do was talk?
Can you understand, Vreej? I am him. I came here on my ship. You took it. I need to borrow your converters. My ship is falling apart.
Wait, hold on, the lead animal said. Yes, they did have translators. They worked. He understood what the animal had said.
You understood? You should have said something. Said you had translators. You made this very hard.
We made this hard? You were outside trying to take our ship apart, the lead one accused. But they weren't using the weapon. Good.
Not to take. Never,
Vreej replied.
Borrowed. Only borrowing. The universe will provide.
He twisted his fingers into the salute of the Great Ones. Even though many had forsaken them, Vreej had not. Even after everything. I think he's insulting you, Chief, the animal behind Vreej said.
No insult. This means blessings on you,
Vreej replied, his sharp teeth clicking as he spoke.
What do we do with him?
The animal with a long mane asked. A female animal. They had males and females too. Like Bulak. Not so different. But strange. Never seen them before.
We'll take him to the brig, then the captain or Rabot can figure out what to do with him, the leader said, lowering the weapon.
She was a female too.
If he's a threat, he's a poor one. What's Rabot?
Vreej asked. One of the animals took him by the arm. Vreej had the idea of using his apparatus, but no, bad idea. They'd shoot him quick. Better to comply. The man who decides your fate, the animal said. Come on, we need to process you through custody.
What's custody?
Vreej asked. Easy concept, but no need to reveal more than needed. Maybe if animals thought him dumb, they might let their guard down. The animal pressed a lot of air through his mouth. It was much smaller than Vreej's, and without sharp teeth, straight teeth. Very strange. We're going to hold you until we know what to do with you. Jail. Always jail.
I know what you can do. Let Vreej go. No threat.
The animal made a strange movement with his mouth and looked back at the leader. Got a funny one, Chief. The chief stepped out of the suit. Much smaller than expected. Only 2 arms, no other appendages. Very strange. Vreej felt the need to flex his mandibles, but kept them tight under his jacket. Never know. Maybe the animals didn't even know they existed. Good surprise if necessary. Good for getting out of jail.
Funny or not, he goes in the lockup. Don't let your guard down.
Aye, aye. Strange. Aye, aye. Yes. Vreej owns 2 eyes. So do animals. Maybe the translator is on the fritz. The animals still in the suits escorted Vreej through the ship. Very clean. Many resources. No wonder so many had targeted. But Vreej was the only one who got close. And now inside. Good for research. Maybe to borrow more later. Always a way around. So many more animals. Though not all. One insect Vreej saw. One. Not sure what. More than one species. Different kind of animals. All. So many. All stared at Vreej with interest. Doors opened automatically in front. So much power. Lots of backups. Vreej needed to see schematics. So much in the jewel worth borrowing.
Search him?
The female asked. Why? It's a force barrier. I doubt he's carrying anything that can break it. You saw the ship he came here in.
Vreej's shuttle. Macumba. Good ship. Reliable.
Vreej wiggled his fingers. Sign of respect. Yeah, whatever, the male said. He placed his squishy hand on Vreege's back. Vreege's heartbeat jumped. But the animal didn't feel mandibles. Instead, guiding Vreege forward, Vreege complied. Better than a fight. Wait it out. Someone will be with you when they get a chance. You've probably noticed we're busy. A blue barrier appeared behind Vreege as he turned around, separating him and the animals. He was alone in a small room. A shelf built into the wall was behind him, and a bowl. He'd investigate later.
Repairs? From all the damage, Vreege said.
Yeah, well, the male exchanged looks with the female. Sit tight. They turned and left. That's what Vreege would do. He sat. It would be as tight as he could manage. 2. You found him doing what? Caspian Robot asked, maintaining a brisk pace down the corridor, with Chief Raffenkel beside him having no trouble keeping up.
Pulling out the fucking power conduits, like they were pieces of a puzzle. I don't know how the hell he didn't kill himself or blow a hole in the side of the ship. Somehow we managed to get one off with no trouble. Those aren't supposed to be removable from the outside. If we hadn't cornered him when we did, I'm sure he would have made off with a couple.
She didn't look at Cass. Instead, kept her gaze in front of them as they made their way down the hall. Whoever this alien was, he'd set off a proximity alert on the side of the ship, and the chief had taken it upon herself to investigate without checking with the bridge first. Though it was probably a good thing she did, otherwise their visitor might have gotten away. Cass and the chief had never gotten along, especially not after the loss of Griffin during Cass's operation to save the ship. But ever since the ship had been disabled by the minefield at Omicron Terminus, she'd been more professional than before, and this was one of those instances he was happy she took the initiative. Did he say anything else? Anything useful? Cass asked. The woman shook her head, her short blonde hair swishing as she did.
He's one weird little fucker. Never seen anything like him. Tried to sweet-talk us into letting him go, after we almost shot him.
Cass glared at her.
He wasn't making any sense. It took the Autovox a minute to read the syntax.
At least he didn't have to deal with a dead body today. They were having enough issues on the ship without an incident with an unknown alien culture. Engineering had just reopened, and he needed to be down there helping Zenfor and Sester get things back up and running, rather than figuring out who this guy was and what he wanted. But it was either him or Lieutenant Uma, who was elbow-deep in the disassembled weapons control systems. Cass sighed. Ever since Evie had forced him into being Tempest's first officer after Captain Green had been critically injured at their encounter at Omicron Terminus, he'd felt a growing pit in his stomach. He'd tried this before, and it hadn't worked out for him. And while the past 2 weeks they'd all been too busy to even think about something like a former criminal filling the second highest posting on the ship, it had been in the back of his mind brewing. This time, though, he'd made a personal commitment he hoped would facilitate his new role. He'd given up drinking for the duration of his time as first officer. Last time, he'd become too dependent on it. And if he was honest with himself, he was always too dependent on it. Perhaps this could be a better situation for him. The ship had taken a lot of damage by those mines the species they called Andromeda set for them. And in the end, it had nearly cost them everything. Had it not been for Zenfor stabilizing the undercurrent drive and Evie's intuition in getting them out of that system, they never would have made it. But now they were adrift again, after the engines had failed for the third time in less than 2 weeks. Thanks to Lieutenant Tyler and his team, engineering had once again been repressurized. Sester had taken his post again. They could only hope he'd be able to get them up and running. If everyone would stop attacking them for 5 minutes. Cass was determined to find out this guy's agenda. He suspected he belonged to the same race of beings who had been strafing Tempest with their tiny craft for the past 10 days. They would come in quick and take a few shots, getting close to the ship before taking off again in their own undercurrents. At first it had been more annoying than anything. But now the ship was starting to take substantial damage, and they couldn't ignore the advantage of interrogating one of their would-be assailants. Cass entered the brig with Raffinkel by his side and took stock of the creature before him. His skin was a mottled gray, but it resembled scales more than skin, with small plates overlapping each other all over his body. His eyes were large and dark, and he had small holes for ears on either side of his head. Only 4 fingers protruded on each hand, with sharp claws at the ends, and his heels were locked high, like his legs were built for running. He resembled one of the dominant species on Sisk, though he had no tail, and his mouth was larger and full of sharp teeth. The being regarded Cass with what he assumed was a genuine curiosity, but he was hunched on the bench inside the brig, unmoving. His clothes were old and patchwork, much like the ship they'd pulled into Bay 2, which was Cass's next stop. But first, answers. "What do they call you?" he asked, facing the creature.
Vreege. Always Vreege,
he responded, his face animated as he spoke.
You?
Cass's eyes narrowed. "Rabot. What is your business with us?"
No business, only borrowing. I borrow to survive.
He shifted on the bench like he wanted to stand, but couldn't. "It's not borrowing, it's stealing. You're stealing vital components of our ship. Why?"
No, only borrow. It will come back. Always comes back. In the end. I needed my ship running on low power. Jewel in space.
Breach seemed more agitated. He was almost shaking on the bench. Cass leaned over to Raffinkel. "Is the translator working properly?" She took out a diagnostic device.
"As far as I can tell."
"Look, Breach," Cass said. "Stand up. You're making me nervous jumping around like that." Breach shot up and approached the barrier separating them. He studied Cass, his movements jerky and uncontrolled, before moving on to Raffinkel and performing a similar examination. Cass turned back to Raffinkel. "Was he in a suit out there?" She shook her head.
"Just what he's got on now. I wish we were that tough." "No suit?"
Breach reached down to his belt. He removed a small orange canister, not more than a few centimeters in diameter.
"Skin curtain."
"Skin curtain?" Cass bared his teeth. "What?"
"Hugs skin tight,"
Breach said.
"Air supply. Keeps the cold out. Warm. Good for space."
Now he understood. "We have something similar," he replied, thinking of their repel fields. "But it's only to keep out disease and protect against low-energy attacks. If we want to leave the ship, we need full suits to protect us from the cold and vacuum."
"Bulaks spend a lot of time in space,"
Reed said, replacing the canister.
"Needed a better solution."
Was Bulak the name of his race? "You attacked us to get parts for your ship, yes?" Cass needed to get this back on track. He couldn't be sidetracked by what was clearly advanced technology.
"Yes. Many thanks for your generosity. Repair Macumba. Keeps me alive."
"No, you don't understand. You can't keep the parts. We need them for our ship." Breach's face fell. "Your friends out there have been damaging our ship for 10 days now. Why?" Breach growled a low frustration.
"Other Bulak are stupid. I am the only one smart enough to get close. Others waste energy. They are not Regis' friends."
"Are you saying others of your kind want our supplies?" Cass asked. It was what he'd suspected. The attacks hadn't been critical enough to do any real damage, more like test runs to see what they could get away with and see how much they could damage in a strafe. He'd surmised their plan was to wear Tempest down to the point where she couldn't fend for herself anymore. Then they'd take her. And it wouldn't be too far from the truth. What reserves they did have were dwindling.
"All Bulak need supplies, but the others, stupid. Vreege clever, getting close."
"Not clever enough, you little bastard," Raffinkel said. "Caught your ass, didn't we?" Vreege only eyed her. Cass couldn't tell if it was with contempt or interest. but the alien brought his hands up so the ends of the claws on his fingers clicked together. Did he have anything else other than those canisters on him?
Not that we saw.
Vreej grinned in response. Cass decided he didn't like that grin. I'm going to look at his ship, see if we can figure out how to detect these guys before they appear out of nowhere. Then maybe we can get a weapons lock on them.
Good. Good for me. Takes care of competition,
the alien replied.
Let me go. No harm done.
No harm? Do you realize we have to go back out there and repair the damage you did from removing those power conduits? Ravenkel accused, stepping closer to the barrier. Vreej took a step back, cowering.
Easy fix. No problems. I can go. Won't try to borrow again.
Cass sighed. Ravenkel turned to him, her eyes boring into him. You can't be thinking about doing it. He shook his head. I'll have to talk to the captain, see what she thinks. We can't hold him forever. Ravenkel turned and stormed off in a huff. Just as well. She needed to cool off and had other responsibilities, like how they were supposed to execute such a delicate repair on the outside of the ship. Not to mention, the sections where the mines had struck were still open to space.
You need parts, yes? I can help,
Vreej said.
In exchange for freedom.
He made a strange motion with his hands, as if he were shooing away a small creature.
All the parts you could need. Good prices.
If they're so good, why don't you just borrow from them instead of us? This guy wasn't going to be much help. He'd have better luck searching through the shuttle. Maybe if Tyler could spare someone, they could get through it quicker.
Vreej has no money. Nothing to trade. Parts are good, but expensive. High security.
Cass almost laughed. He was more than familiar with the problem. He talked to Evie, see how she wanted to handle their newest passenger. More than likely, they'd let him go under the threat of disintegration if he ever came back. That was, if Uma could get the weapons back up and working again. Anything I should know about your ship before I go searching? That grin was back. The one that told Cass he wouldn't like the answer.
No. Go ahead. Shuttle clear.
Yeah, right. He should grab his old boom cannon before boarding the shuttle. Maybe these Bulak had no concept of subterfuge, as it had to be the poorest lie he'd ever heard. Cass would need to do a few sweeps before boarding that ship. I'll be back later, he said. Don't go anywhere.
No,
Vreej replied.
I'll stay right here.
3. Exhausted from scanning the unending report, Evelyn Diazol ran her hands down her face, massaging the deep sockets that had become the receptacles for what was left of her eyes. Ever since their escape at Omicron Terminus, it had been one thing after another, in what could only amount to a slow cascade failure of every system on the ship. If it wasn't the life support systems, it was the propulsion. If it wasn't propulsion, it was the weapons. On and on. Those mines had done some major damage, and she wasn't sure Tempest could recover. At least not without a couple weeks or even a season in space dock. They didn't have the supplies out here to complete all the repairs on their own. The engineering section alone was a mess, with the adjacent sections on Deck 11 still open to space from where one of the mines had nearly crippled them. They'd only managed to get Commander Sester, their resident Klaxian, back inside yesterday, and the news hadn't been good. They'd had to stop again, because some of the raw fuel was leaking into an adjacent system, which was both a curse and a blessing. A curse, because they had to find a way to recoagulate the material for use again, and a blessing that it hadn't just vented into space and been lost forever. And then there were the attacks. They'd began just after they'd left what she and Cass had dubbed Option C, a possible planetoid that might have provided raw materials for the ship to use. But on the first trip down, it had been clear the planet was too volatile to mine, and they'd given up, returning to open space in hopes of finding a new source of materials. That's when the first of the tiny ships appeared. At first, they were nothing more than small points of light in the distance, studying perhaps. But after repeated communication attempts had gone unanswered, not that the comm towers were in the best of shape anyway, Evie had chosen to ignore them, in hopes they were nothing more than curious. Which in hindsight hadn't been the best decision. Every 12 hours since, they'd send another one of their tiny ships to make runs against Tempest. And despite Lieutenant Uma's best efforts, the things were damn hard to hit. They had a scattering field, which confused the sensors, and made manual targeting the only option. When she finally would get a lock, they were back on their way out of the system, out of range. So far, there had been 14 attacks, not counting whatever Raffenkill found this morning. She checked the comm. Cass should have been back with a report by now. Just as she moved to get up, the door to the command room chimed. "Enter," she said, readjusting herself on the seat. "Sorry," Cass replied, walking in, data bar in his hand. His face was covered in sweat, and his brown hair, which had grown shaggy since the attacks, was plastered against his skull. "That shuttle of his is damn hot. Took longer than I would have liked." "You talked to him?" Evie asked. Cass handed her the data bar, which she tapped, bringing up a short report. It was brief, but gave the basic information. So far, Cass was turning out to be a competent first officer when he wasn't worried about the chain of command. It had turned out to be a better situation than when he'd temporarily taken his commission back without a role. Then again, no one had had much rest in almost 2 weeks, and she didn't expect anyone to care too much about decorum. Cass brushed his shoulder, checking behind him. "You okay?" she prompted. "Yeah, fine. Just really big spiders in that ship." He shuddered. She had to work to keep a smile off her face. "Arachnophobic, are we?" "No, Look, the shuttle's got a level 6 barrier around it now, so they can't get out. It could be a health issue. You never know what kind of diseases a creature like that might be carrying." "You mean in its fuzzy little abdomen?" She stifled a laugh. It was the best she'd felt all week. "It's not funny." He checked his back again and took the seat across from her. It was so strange being on this side of the table. Usually, she'd be on the other side, giving her reports to Green. Anyway, he says he needed parts for his ship. And considering the shape it's in, I'm not surprised, Cass said. I've seen better Sargan garbage scows. If it had made it another 5 light years, I'd be surprised.
"Does he know anything about any of the other attacks?"
She turned the data bar off, setting it to the side. Claims not to. Called them a waste of energy. He might just be a scavenger, looking for a way to survive.
"By poaching off us?"
Evie shook her head. The worst part about this was being so cut off from the Coalition. The closest Coalition ship was at best almost 200 days away across an unexplored expanse of space. And that was if they could even call for help, which, because of the damage to their long-range communication grid, they couldn't. They barely had internal comms. So that meant they were all alone out here, something Evie wasn't keen to advertise. Not to mention, there was still the possibility the entire reason they'd come out here, the Andromeda aliens, as the Coalition had called them, could still be close. Or they could be on their way to Earth already. It was impossible to know, because they had some method of disguising themselves inside pockets of time. That's how Cass had encountered them when he and some of the others had gone looking. And even though they had some limited information, Evie wasn't sure it was enough to report back. They hadn't discovered any weaknesses, only more strengths. She sighed and stood, facing the large window behind the desk that looked out onto the obsidian tapestry of space. How had Captain Green done it? And when would she be able to hand the job back over to him? She'd been happy to take over when he was injured, but this was nothing more than a temporary assignment, just as Cass's position was. When Green was better, she'd retake her position as first officer and he could go back to doing whatever it was he did in his off time. She'd always wanted her own command, but not stranded and with the ship falling apart around her. Even further back in her mind were the 22 members of the crew they'd lost in the attack, for whom they still hadn't managed to have funeral services for. "Tough day?" Cass asked. She rolled her eyes. "Smartass. I just don't know how much longer we can keep this up. I've been thinking about emergency preparations. We already have people on rations and have diverted all the energy from non-essential parts of the ship to support our primary functions. But what else can we do?" He shrugged. "We could cut power to the lower 3 decks and have people double up on their bunks. Save some energy there. Any maintenance could be done in an envirosuit." It wasn't a bad idea. It would conserve some energy, at least. But they couldn't limp along forever. At some point, they'd need to find some source of raw materials and energy. Otherwise, they'd have no choice but abandon the ship. And that wasn't an option under her watch. She wasn't about to have her first command ending in the loss of her ship. "I also want to lower our general power output as soon as we're ready for another jump. I'm afraid we're lit up like a bunch of fireworks out here, and that's how those ships keep finding us. If we can't find a way to defend ourselves, they'll eventually wear us down." "That's a good idea. I tried to find a way to use Vreege's ship." "Vreege?" She arched an eyebrow. That's what he called himself. "I'm not sure if the autovox is working correctly. But I couldn't find anything on his ship that resembled the scattering field they're using. Whatever it is, he doesn't have one." "Great," she said, her sarcasm seeping through. "The one ship we could have actually taken out, and he's dumb enough to try and peel parts off the ship." "Did he give you anything else?" Cass huffed, like he was holding something back. "I don't know how reliable it is. He says he knows where to get the parts we need." She arched an eyebrow. "But they're expensive. If they exist at all. If it's not a trap." She locked eyes with him. "What's your feeling about it?" He leaned back, taking longer to formulate his thoughts than she would like. Was this how she had been with Green? She always gave him her honest opinion, even if it was hard to hear. She hoped Cass would do the same. "I know you're not going to want to hear this, but we need an ally out here. This is obviously an inhabited part of space. I think we find someone, bargain some kind of trade, and get these assholes off our backs." He was right. She didn't want to hear it. "That's ironic coming from you." It was his turn to look intrigued. "You want to start your own little coalition out here," she added. "I don't have a problem with a coalition when it's founded on trust," he replied. "Plus, it doesn't need to be permanent." "And you think we could really trust someone out here? Someone we know little or nothing about? For all we know, our guest in the brig could be a spy, sent by whoever has been taking these shots at us." I said he wouldn't like it. She walked around the desk, keeping her eyes on him. "Say we do find someone to ally ourselves with. What do we have to offer? We can barely stay afloat as it is." He shook his head. "I don't have a clue. And we probably won't know unless we try and find out. And what if we end up attracting the wrong kind of attention? Say we seek out one of these species, and they see us as nothing but an easy target to be captured. It seems to be the modus operandi out here." She sat back on the edge of the table, crossing her arms. No matter how she looked at it, she didn't like the outcome. There were too many variables and too many unknowns. Searching for an ally close to coalition space was difficult enough. This far out, and there was no telling what they were in for. There was a reason exploration ships didn't come out here anymore. None had ever returned. She wasn't sure how much this alliance idea appealed to Cass, or if he was just making the suggestion to give her options. "I don't see that we have much choice. For now, we can afford to remain solitary. But for how much longer?" She made a grumbling noise in her throat. He was right. If they didn't find a natural source of base materials soon, or something they could convert into energy, they'd end up adrift before they made it even halfway back to the Coalition.
Have you talked to Zenfor?
Not since they got engineering opened. I was headed there when this genius showed up. She stood again.
Let's get a status update from her. I want to know what the odds are of getting her engine modifications back online. They're what's stranded us out here.
Zenfor had provided them with the technological means to cover a great distance of space in a short amount of time with proprietary technology from the sill. Except it had been damaged during the attack and hadn't worked since. He stood as well. I'll check. But if we can't even keep the undercurrent in place, I doubt.
Just let's not make any more assumptions until we know all the facts.
She dropped her head, pinching the bridge of her nose. How's the big chair working out? Cass asked.
Not exactly like I'd hoped, she replied,
her voice muffled by her hand. She snapped her head back up again and blinked a few times.
I'll be glad when he's back.
Have you been down there lately? Cass relaxed his posture. All semblance of formality between them was gone. In an instant, they'd passed back into that easy relationship they'd shared from the beginning. She shook her head. Maybe it will do you some good to get off the bridge for a few minutes. We can talk to Zax, check on his prognosis.
Yeah,
Evie replied, even though she had half a dozen things that needed taken care of on the bridge. Maybe a break was what she needed. 4.
You said our visitor looks Siskian?
Evie asked as they got out of the hypervator on level 14. She seemed to be making conversation to fill the uncomfortable silence between them. One of them, anyway, Cass replied. He hadn't met a representative from each of the Siskians' dominant species, but he had seen one that resembled their new prisoner. Back on my parole board, there was a reptile Siskian as one of the board members. They hate that, Evie replied, a smile in her words. I know, but I can't help it. They look reptilian. What other word is there for it?
They prefer the term similist, as do all the species on Sisk. If you go around calling people reptiles, mammals, or anything else, you're bound to get the shit beat out of you. But the proper name for the species you're describing is Ashkaz.
They turned the corner that headed down to sickbay. How long did you live there?
15 years. It's like a microcosm for the Coalition itself. All those different species, sharing the same planet, the same resources.
Cass laughed to himself. Now I see where you get it.
What?
Your eternal optimism. Before she could counter with a quip of her own, he continued. Well, he looks Ashkazian then. Except he doesn't have a tail, and his skin or his plates, whatever they are thicker.
That's fascinating, she replied. All this way out here, and there's another species not too different from one of the Coalition. Maybe they're distant cousins.
He shrugged again. It wasn't impossible. There was plenty of evidence of ancient species migrating all over space. There was no reason a species from this region couldn't have found its way to one of the Coalition's outer planets. Many of his ancient maps were from civilizations long gone, who used to chart the stars before humans learned how to farm. As they reached the doors to sickbay, Cass noticed Evie wasn't beside him anymore. He turned and saw she'd stopped a few meters away, staring at the door. Hey, you okay? She nodded, but the movement was short and sharp. Have you been here to see him since it happened? She shook her head.
Not since the day we got the news. I've been too busy.
Or this was harder for her than he'd thought. Maybe she hadn't been trying to fill the silence between her and Cass, but her and what she was about to face. She and the captain hadn't served together a long time, but they developed a respect for each other. That's how it went when a captain and their XO matched up well. It was something he thought he had with Rutledge, but it had all turned out to be nothing more than lies. For Evie, though, he suspected it was real.
We don't have... No, she replied. I want to. I just...
needed a second. She stepped past him, and the door slid open for her, revealing the inside of sickbay. It was a wide space with a lot of stations around this side of the room, with tall ceilings. 3 of the beds were still occupied by injuries from the attack a few weeks ago. Cass hadn't realized some people still hadn't recovered. He'd need to pay more attention to the personnel reports coming through to him. It was something he shouldn't have missed. Off to the side stood Box, his companion for 5 years and newly minted doctor for the USCS Tempest. Since passing his written tests and earning the title 6 days ago, Cass had heard of little else when the robot decided to drop into whatever he was doing. Box turned upon seeing them, and his yellow eyes flashed in excitement. "You came! I assume you're here to see a top-level medical demonstration from the Coalition's newest and most experienced doctor. I'll just take Henderson over here." He strode over to one of the crewmen lying peacefully on the beds, "and we'll induce some mild cardiac arrhythmia." Both Cass and Evie jolted forward before Box stopped mid-stride, his eyes blinking at them. Cass recognized it as his version of laughter. "He's been pulling that crap all day," Crewman Henderson said from the bed, coughing. "Anyone who comes in—" He coughed again, harder. Box finished making his way over to him, adjusting one of the sensors on his bed. Henderson's coughing subsided. "I told you, pretend to be asleep. It's much more morbid when they think I'm going to do it to a sleeping man. You're not supposed to be talking anyway." Box glanced back up at them. "He's been my best patient so far." Evie went over by the crewman's bed. "Thank you for humoring him." Henderson shook his head. "He's a delight. Keeps a smile on my face." "One more word, and I'll induce a coma," Box replied. Henderson nodded, smirking. Box turned to them. "He inhaled a lot of actinium, and it's taking his lungs a while to heal. But he's doing much better now that we've started the second treatment." Cass took stock of his friend. Most of the time he'd known Box, he'd been barely more than a lazy, self-centered ass, concerned with little else other than watching net dramas. But ever since they'd come aboard Tempest, he'd seemed to have found his calling as a healer. Though he cringed at the idea of referring to him as Doctor. Box finished adjusting some of the readouts on the display beside Henderson's bed. "So, what can a doctor do for the captain and her first mate?" "Don't call me that," Cass replied. "Arrrr," Box said. "We're here," Evie asserted, glancing between the two of them, "to check on the captain. I wanted to get a status update." "Oh," Box said, his tone neutral. "Sure. This way." He led them through the large partitions separating one side of sickbay from the other. On the far side sat the chief medical officer, Zax, where she sat inside her office, working on her terminal. She glanced up when she saw them come into view. "Captain, Mr. Rabot, I wasn't aware." She stood from her desk. Cass noticed she had not one, but 2 different input terminals. One set on the desk itself, and one she held in her second set of hands. He bet she could write reports faster than anyone on the ship. Except maybe Box. Evie held up her hand. "This is unscheduled. We wanted to see how he was doing." Zax's face fell slightly. "I'm afraid there hasn't been much change. And since we won't be getting back to a starbase soon, I'm taking the situation into my own hands. I'm working on developing a new treatment right now, one that I hope will allow me to get a better look at the kind of damage the captain has suffered." She turned the face of her terminal to them. "See? The captain suffered a lot of trauma in this area." She pointed to the longitudinal fissure that separated the 2 halves of the brain. "The central sulcus," Box whispered to no one in particular. "There's some deep bruising in there. I'm hoping this new round of calorsium will allow us to figure out how much damage we can heal and how much we can live with. Otherwise, his condition hasn't changed." "How long until the treatment is ready?" Evie asked, her voice betraying its anxiousness. If Cass noticed, he bet Zax did as well. "I don't want to say," she replied. "This is experimental, and I can't give a time frame or even a guarantee it will work. But I'll keep you updated." Evie nodded.
I guess that's all we can hope for. Thanks, Doc. Any time.
Zax took her seat again, while Evie turned and left. Cass and Box followed, close behind. That hadn't been what either of them had wanted to hear. Captain Green was the foundation on which the crew was built. Without him in the captain's chair, Evie was left to do it on her own, despite Cass's promotion. His role here was temporary, which is why he assumed most of the crew followed his orders and did what needed to be done, because they knew they'd be rid of him soon enough, and they didn't want Evie coming back to her job and finding out they hadn't been pulling their weight. He was a substitute, temporary and replaceable, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to do a good job. This ship needed all the help it could get, and until things returned to normal, he would do his best to ensure their survival. Perhaps it would help to take Evie's mind off the subject at hand. As they reached the doors to sickbay, he leaned over to Box. Hey, you remember that time the Arustian boarded the Reasonable Excuse and tried to steal her from us? Absolutely. The first thing you did was cower in the corner, your arms wrapped around your knees. Classic Caspian, Box replied. Evie turned and eyed him with interest. Obviously, that didn't happen, Cass replied, his face growing red. Sure it did. He blew the hatch, and you screamed this really high-pitched scream, so loud that I thought I'd lost an audio processor, Box said. And then you ran into your room like a child. Box lifted his chest. I, of course, had to fight him off in hand-to-hand combat, in which I managed to overpower him and take his weapons. I then unceremoniously tossed him out the airlock. Cass crossed his arms. Oh, really? Because if I recall correctly, he shot you 3 times, blowing your main power source, and it took me 2 weeks to get you back on your feet. Was all that what you dreamed while I was in the middle of taking you apart and putting you back together again? You mean I bravely allowed him to shoot me to give us more time to formulate our counterattack, Box replied. What does this have to do with anything? Evie asked, tapping her foot. The point I was trying to get to, Cass said, was that I managed to send a distress signal to one of Venus' ships nearby. They made it over to us, and together we took care of the Arustian, while the Tin Man over here was out cold. I didn't scream. I want to be very clear on that point. Box huffed. It wasn't my fault you didn't upgrade my armor. And he had split-point rounds. Those could penetrate unprocessed alcurium ore. You're not going to give up on this, are you? Evie asked, ignoring Box. I think it's worth exploring, at least until a better option comes along. Give up on what? Box asked. Evie stared up at his yellow eyes. Caspian thinks we need allies out here. That if we continue like this, we won't have a chance to make it back home. He's not wrong. In our current state, there's no way we're making it back to Coalition space. We'll probably be destroyed long before then, or dismantled, or get sucked into a dark fissure, or— Box, Cass yelled. You're not helping. Evie took a deep breath. Get down to engineering. See what Zenfor and Sester say about the engines. Then I'll make a decision. In the meantime, I'll have one of the science crews go over our new friend's shuttle, just in case you missed something. Just tell them to wear enviro suits, Cass replied, in case one of those things had egg sacs or something. A smile played at her lips. I'll make sure they know. 5. Evie took the Hypervator up 1 level to 13, alone. It would have been just as easy to comp science lab too, but she had another reason for visiting in person. And since the day had been terrible so far, she felt like she deserved a little indulgence. She'd hoped the news about Green would have been better. Though, had there been any significant developments, Zax would have calmed her instead of waiting for her to visit. It was wishful hoping on her part. The slow realization of the situation fell on her like snow blanketing the ground. There was a good possibility Green wouldn't wake up, and she would need to take on this mantle permanently. She wasn't even sure how she was supposed to do that. Being captain was a lot different from being first officer. The first officer always had someone else there to help guide them. And while the seasoned XO might not need any guidance, Tempest had been Evie's first posting as second-in-command. She'd fully expected to spend 4 or 5 years getting used to the job before being offered her own ship. She'd imagined something much more formal, something with more gravitas to mark the occasion. Not that she wanted the pageantry, but she did want it to be significant. More than just an assumption of power. He hadn't even been able to transfer command to her due to his injuries. She'd just assumed it. Assumed she was qualified. She needed more sessions with Sester. They were helping to calm and focus her mind, even if she couldn't quite remember all the images from when they were close to the alien ship. Evie had managed to get them out of that situation by tapping into something deep within herself, something she couldn't even explain. And in what little downtime she'd found since, she'd worked with Sester inside his mind place to try and figure out what it all meant. Unfortunately, she hadn't made much progress since that very first session. And now that he was back in engineering, it was unlikely he'd be able to find the time for her. All of which fed into the anxiety of what if? What if the hallucinations came back? What if she couldn't sleep again? What if she just couldn't do the job? Evie reached the primary science labs and made her way over to Science 2, tapping on the door. It slid open to reveal the large space in disarray. After one of the mines had exploded, it had eventually caused a power conduit to rupture in this section, blowing out half the relays on the deck. Which technically wouldn't have been a problem, since the science wings weren't essential to the ship's operation, except that 2 of Tempest's main weapon systems, the dart controls and the blade generators, ran behind the same bulkheads and had ruptured along with the power conduits. They'd had to remove half the equipment so they could start tearing the bulkheads away to get to the affected systems. A maintenance crew had the entire wall exposed, while Lieutenant Laura Yamashita directed them as to which systems needed their attention first. All the scientists who worked in this lab had already migrated to other areas to assist in repairs. Laura turned when Evie entered, and a smile flashed across her face, before hiding it again.
"Yeah, right there," she said, "between the backup vacuum chamber and the muon prism. Remove those and get the plating off to expose the conduit."
After the weapon systems had gone down, Lieutenant Uma had assigned Laura down here to oversee the repairs, since she was familiar with both the weapons and the science systems, having come from exobiology. Evie couldn't have made a better call herself.
"Lieutenant, may I have a word?"
"Of course, Captain," Laura replied. She had to hand it to her. Laura was good at keeping her emotions under wraps. There was barely a hint of anything in her voice, other than a standard reply.
"Keep working on that, and I'll be back in a few minutes."
She turned and sauntered her way toward Evie, throwing in a little extra emphasis in her walk, but not enough to be readily noticeable unless someone was really paying attention, which Evie was. She'd been paying very close attention ever since Omicron Terminus, when Laura had helped her through her episodes.
"What can I do for you, Captain?"
Laura asked, a wide smile on her face. She had specs fluid dotting her face, like one of the hydraulic systems had ruptured too. But it didn't detract from her beauty. Evie had always found her attractive, but ever since she thought Laura might have died in the attack, she couldn't suppress the feelings any longer. Evie glanced up at the maintenance crew. All of them were focused on the power conduits, not paying them any attention. She leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on Laura's lips, before pulling away quickly. Laura barely had any time to react, but her smile grew even wider.
"I just needed a friendly face," Evie said.
Laura's features shifted into understanding.
"How bad is it?" "It's not getting any better. And I just came from sickbay. There's been no change with the captain."
Laura rubbed her arm sympathetically.
"You're the captain, and you're doing a great job."
Evie sighed, lowering her voice.
"The ship can't keep withstanding these attacks if we don't do something drastic."
"Like?"
"Cass thinks we should make an alliance with someone before these little ships cripple us."
Laura grimaced.
"What do you think?" "On one hand, I think he's right. An alliance makes sense. We could pool resources, fix ourselves, and get home faster. On the other hand, I can't ignore the possibility we'd be opening ourselves up to even further trouble. Who's to say whomever we make an alliance with decides to take what we have by force, or sabotage us?
Laura wiped something at Evie's cheek. Her finger came away with a dark smudge. Some of the fluid from Laura's face must have transferred to her own.
It's a gamble, you're right. But do we have a choice? For the time being, we still do. But if Centaur can't get those engines back up and running, we'll be out of supplies and energy in less than a season.
Laura's eyes danced.
Are you just venting, or do you want my opinion?
Evie shrugged.
Both. Neither, she chuckled. I don't know. I just wanted to see you. We haven't had much time together since this.
She waved her hand at the back wall. Laura turned to face the maintenance crew, still working hard on removing all the necessary components.
Yeah, it's great, because when the designers built this ship, they put the most essential components of the defense systems behind everything else, which was stellar planning on their part.
Evie almost laughed out loud.
I'm sorry. What's the prognosis? Maybe another day to get it fixed?
She turned back to her.
And before you tell me that's too long, because they'll be attacking again soon, I already know. But we can't go any faster. It's delicate work.
Damn, Evie replied. Laura had read her mind. They needed to get the weapon systems back online for the next attack, which could come any time in the next 6 to 8 hours if they kept to their schedule.
Looks like we'll have to send the Space Wings out. Because I'm awesome, I'm going to go ahead and tell you why you came down here in the first place.
Laura leaned in.
What? Not only did you need the opinion of the most qualified member of your crew about our current predicament, but you also wanted to ask me out on a date.
Evie crossed her arms and mirrored her movement, giving her an easy shove.
Is that so? By my count, we're a few behind, and you can't blame me for wanting to see you more.
Evie huffed.
I'll just have to rectify that. I have an excellent assortment of ration bars stocked in my quarters for later. Gourmet ration bars?
Laura asked, her eyebrows wiggling.
You know it. Only the best for you.
Laura laughed and turned to face Evie.
Sounds wonderful.
Her eyes flicked back and forth, and Evie felt more vulnerable than she ever had in her life. But it was a good kind of vulnerable, the kind she wanted, but so rarely obtained. She felt as if Laura could see the real her, the her beneath the surface, the one where all the bullshit was stripped away, and what remained was Evie's true essence. She'd never felt that with anyone else, and before Laura hadn't even known it to be possible. But she was sure in her conviction that Laura saw her for who she really was.
What do you think I should do? She whispered.
Laura's face softened.
You really want my opinion?
She hesitated a moment.
I agree with our first officer. I think if the principles of the Coalition can work back home, then they can work here too. It's like starting over. Yeah. Except out here, we don't have the Klaxians to watch over us as we reach out to other species.
Was she the only one who thought seeking out other species was a bad idea? All she could think of was how it had led to a coalition full of subterfuge and secrecy. As best she knew, the Klaxians still didn't know about what Admiral Rutledge and the crew of the Atlas had done when they'd captured a Syl ship and tried to use its technology. And that was something she was complicit in. If they were willing to hide something like that from their closest allies, how many more secrets did the Coalition hold? Were the Klaxians or the Untuburu or the Yax-Inax keeping secrets from the humans? And where would it end?
Evelyn? Sweetie? Are you okay?
Laura asked. Evie gave her head a little shake, fluttering her eyes.
Sorry, I just zoned out there for a minute. You really think we could make an alliance work? Well, I mean, don't go after the biggest and baddest species out there. I talked to someone who was in a similar position as us. Someone who couldn't necessarily overpower us if they got too desperate, but who also needed help. That's a fine line to walk, Evie replied, especially when so much of the space is uncharted.
Laura grinned.
You'll figure it out. Now, let me get back to work. Otherwise, I'll have to file a formal complaint.
That sounds like a threat, Evie replied.
You know it,
she said, echoing Evie's earlier words. She took a deep breath.
My quarters for dinner? 1,500?
Laura began strolling back to the maintenance crew.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Evie kissed her index and middle fingers and stretched them out to Laura. Laura mimicked the movement, then turned her attention back to her job. Evie let her eyes linger a moment longer before leaving the science wing. As she made her way back to the hypervator to return to the bridge, she pondered Laura's advice. Maybe she and Cass were right. But they couldn't go into this thing blind and full of optimism. They needed to be careful. But if the only reason she was hesitating was because of the current state of their own coalition, then it didn't make sense. She needed to wait to hear back from Cass. In the meantime, it was imperative they defend themselves against the next attack. She tapped the comm at the back of her hand.
Chief Ravenkel?
Go ahead, Captain, the chief said.
I need you to prepare 4 of your fighters. It seems our primary weapon systems won't be back up in time, and we're going to need some defending against the next attack. Be prepared to launch at a moment's notice.
Finally, Ravenkel said.
A suggestion, Captain?
Go ahead.
Let us sit out there and wait for them. We can use Tempest as cover. They won't know we're there until it's too late. Will you be okay out there for a few hours on your own?
Evie reached the hypervator, stepping inside. Ravenkel chuckled.
The Space Corps can take much worse, trust me. They used to drop us out on set and make us survive a week on our own. A couple of hours in a space wing is nothing. If you say so, Chief, proceed at your own discretion. They could be here any time. Acknowledged. Ravenkel out.
Evie took another breath. Hopefully, they'd have better luck. Now, if only engineering would cooperate. 6. Cass stepped through the main rollaway door that separated engineering from the rest of the ship. It was stuck halfway in place, and when he pushed on it, it didn't budge a centimeter. There was barely enough room for a human to make it through the opening. He didn't even want to know how the 4-meter-tall Sester made it through. Commander! Cass glanced over to see the newly promoted Lieutenant Tyler jogging toward him. Tyler had been instrumental in keeping engineering from collapsing entirely during the attack, and Evie had rewarded him with a well-deserved promotion. But his already present anxiety had only seemed to increase in conjunction with his newfound authority. You don't have to call me that, Tyler. I've told you before, I don't have an official rank. Just a position on the ship, Cass replied. Tyler took a breath. I know. It's just easier. Commander, it's a mess down here. My guys did the best they could while it was depressurized, but we've got a lot of major systems that will need full overhauls. Those mines really fucked us. Cass blew out a long breath. Give me the worst of it. Long-range comms are down. Probably for good. We have internal ship communications, and we can do short-range to shuttles and nearby planets, but that's it. Nothing beyond a light year. The transmitters have been destroyed, and building a new one will take longer than getting back to Coalition space. Damn. He was afraid of that. Without the comms, they couldn't even reach out to any nearby ships. They'd have to wait until they came in close. What else? Sester says the undercurrent system is salvageable with the right components. For now, any further use is going to put strains on the system and possibly cause a rupture. We've only got 3 of the 4 emitters working. I realize we're out in the middle of nowhere and we can't stay here, but for the time being, we recommend sparing use of it only. He wiped his brow. Sweat was pouring down from under his crop of red hair. Have you spoken to Zenfor about her technology? Tyler's face turned into a grimace. I tried. She wasn't in a mood to talk. Cass nodded. Don't worry. I'll speak to her.
Anything else? I've spoken to Uma, and we think we can get the weapons back without too much of a problem, but we've got multiple parts of the ship where I'm worried about the structural integrity. Wolf and I agree we'll need to focus our efforts on containing those sections, unless we want the ship to pull itself apart in the undercurrents. If we could find a fresh source of galvanium, we could be back up and running with modest repairs. Our other option is to build an energy collector with what we have on hand and try to synthesize what we need. But that will take longer.
Cass sucked his lips between his teeth, thinking. They needed the collector, even if it would take forever. If you can spare the people, get started on the collector. There's no guarantee we'll find the materials we need out here. The sooner we get started, the better. Tyler nodded.
Yes, sir.
He turned to some of his staff.
Sophie, get down to Science 1 and find Dr. Amargosa. We're going to need her help.
He turned back to Cass.
She's got a background in thermodynamics.
Cass wasn't sure if he meant Sophie or Amargosa. Either way, it didn't matter. It was clear Tyler had really stepped into his role here and was handling things nicely. Cass glanced over to the massive form of Commander Sester, who lay in his custom-built cradle at the far end of the room, operating many of the engineering components from inside.
Where's...
He saw her before he finished his thought. She was over close to Sester, bent over a console, her stern face like a blade in its intensity. He hadn't been looking forward to this. Cass turned back to Tyler. Carry on. Tyler nodded and returned to his duties while Cass made his way across engineering. There was debris everywhere. Evie had filled him in on how they barely got out after the mine had blown a hole in the deck below, and how Box had been instrumental in helping everyone escape. He'd never tell him to his face, but Cass was proud of how far he'd come in such a short time, and he felt guilty for keeping him on the reasonable excuse for all those years. Box thrived when he was around more people, and when he had something worthwhile to do. Piloting a junky courier ship hadn't been enough for him, and Cass couldn't help but think where Box might be had he not been holding him back. Probably fencing stolen net dramas in the Sargan Commonwealth, a voice deep inside him said. He approached her from the side, making sure to stay where he knew he was in her peripheral vision. From the scowl on her face, the last thing he wanted was to startle her and have her rip his head off in retaliation. He'd already endured 2 punches to the face, and wasn't sure he could take another hit without some brain damage.
Consul?
He asked.
Caspian. How are you feeling?
What does that matter? Her eyes hadn't left the screen she'd been staring at, though it didn't seem like she was changing any of the inputs.
I just figured since you almost died out there. I told you, Sil lungs are resilient, and Zax didn't need to keep me. I'm fine.
She tensed, and Cass's eyes narrowed. She'd managed to reset the undercurrent system by exposing herself to the vacuum of space, and she'd only needed minimal recovery time in sickbay. But he knew better than to push the issue. It was a bad idea to argue with a Sil, or at least this particular Sil.
What's the story with your enhancements to our engines?
Cass asked.
I told you I'd get them fixed, and I will.
There was an anxiousness in her voice he'd never heard before. Even when she was wrong, she had conviction. But this sounded like something else.
When can I tell the captain they'll be ready? With the undercurrent offline, I know she's... They'll be ready when I say they're ready,
Zenvor growled. Her 2-meter frame seemed to heave with fury. Cass took a precautious step back.
I'm going to need more than that. Hours? Days? Weeks?
She flashed him a glare that he thought would pierce his soul. Her mouth curled into a snarl.
It's your damn primitive equipment. How am I supposed to get anything done with your ancient technology? It might as well be 2 Gersels pulling a cart.
Cass had no idea what a Gersel was, but he caught the general idea. That doesn't sound promising. She slammed her massive hands at the console, cracking it straight down the middle. Lightning flashed through Cass, as for a brief moment he thought she might actually lash out at him and the crew. Everyone had stopped what they were doing, save Sester, and were now staring at her. She took a deep breath, though Cass noticed another tiny shudder, and took 2 steps to the right, activating the console beside the one she'd broken, and bringing up the same information as before. "Zenfor, give me the truth. How bad is it?" Cass asked.
The system is offline, and I don't know if I can repair it, not with the equipment I have here.
She turned to him again.
How do you deal with it? So many things going wrong. SIL ships have natural built-in redundancies. We don't experience failure on this scale. Things don't keep going wrong.
The ship has some redundancies, but not enough to combat the kind of damage we suffered. The ship's armor wasn't up when the mines hit us, and they struck some strategic points which... He'd only just now realized how surgical the strikes had been. Close to the bridge, close to engineering. Enough to knock out their propulsion, but not enough to destroy them completely. That ship that had been hiding in the time pocket had wanted to reach them, not destroy them. But for what? Threat assessment? They'd probably never know.
This ship isn't a ship at all. It's a child's toy, Zenfor growled. If we find suitable replacement parts, I won't be standing by idle. I'm tired of my life being in the hands of people who don't understand basic physics.
At least he wasn't talking about abandoning them, though he wasn't quite sure what she was hinting at. "I'll tell the captain the system is down until further notice," he finally said, "or until we can resupply."
"And rebuild,"
she added. Cass thought that was about as good as he was going to get. He left her to ponder at her station. She still might find a way out of this with what little they had on hand, but everything kept coming back to restocking and resupplying the ship with the necessary components. Sure, they'd had some replacement components on hand, but a lot of those had been blown into space during the attack, and they'd had no time to retrieve them. Which meant, unfortunately, it left them undersupplied and out of luck when it came to repairing a lot of the existing systems. He hated to do it, but he'd have to inform Evie right away. Maybe it would help convince her to make a decision about searching for help, or even entertaining Reese's offer. As Cass left engineering, he caught Tyler giving him a friendly nod. Surprised, he returned the gesture and left feeling more confident than when he'd come in, despite the bad news.
You seem distressed. What can I do to help?
Zenfor grimaced as she stared at the console. The information wasn't going to change. The calculations weren't going to magically work themselves out. So why did she continue to watch the screen like she might see something she hadn't already been over 1,000 times?
Because you don't want to let them down,
Sester said in her mind.
That's not it,
she thought. It was strange communicating this way, but she preferred it to verbal communication. It reminded her of being home, where not everything had to be done manually. Talking to Sester was easier than anything else on this ship.
Thank you. I feel much the same way.
Inside, she smiled, though she'd never let it show on her face. She preferred to keep it all hidden. And now for Sester too, she supposed. But that was okay. She didn't mind him seeing. He'd been the primary reason she'd been interested in coming on the ship in the first place.
You flatter me. It's true. It was why I volunteered to come aboard rather than stay on the Coalition starbase with Molesse. You miss her very much.
His thoughts pierced her. There was a drawback to this kind of communication. Little could be hidden or obfuscated, and she wasn't one who was open with others.
It is okay to miss people. I too miss my own kind.
She hadn't considered that.
I hadn't considered your feelings about your own people. Would you like to speak to me about them?
In addition to listening to his concerns, it might also keep the focus off her for a while.
You don't have to use subterfuge with me. If you don't wish to discuss your situation, please say so. No deception is required.
Inwardly, she grimaced.
I apologize. I'm not used to being the focus of anything. It's uncomfortable. That is all right. I will take you up on your offer, as it isn't often I am able to speak of my people, especially in the presence of other coalition members. But you might understand better. Understand what?
What concerns could a Claxian have? She knew not everyone was receptive to a Claxian's thoughts, but at least a few people on board were, including Caspian and Lieutenant Tyler. Not to mention Acting Captain Diazol.
The captain isn't technically receptive to my thoughts. She can't hear me unless I bring her into a shared space. And yes, while I can help her and speak with the others, it isn't the same as speaking with my own kind. You are perhaps the first person I've met I can be completely honest with. I'm honored, she replied. I'm unaware if you know, but Claxians do not often leave our homeworld. We are bound to it in many ways, preferring instead to allow others to come to us. This has been both beneficial and disastrous for us in the past.
Zenfor shuddered. She couldn't imagine inviting alien species to Thesleia. It would do nothing but leave them open to attack, or worse.
Many other species feel the same way you do, but not mine. We are a race of pacifists, and when others came to conquer us, they may succeed for a short amount of time, but only until we build sufficient technology to repel them from the planet. Just because we do not like war doesn't mean we won't fight for our home. So many of us stay and decide not to leave our system. I've read some of your history. What about the humans? The humans came to us in great need. They were dying, killing themselves, really. But they were also looking for something, reaching out. And we took pity on them. And now, a few thousand years later, see what we have built together. Had it not been for the humans, we never would have entered into this coalition. But they convinced us it was in the best interest in all of our people. And no one has attacked Claxia Prime since. I can't say that they were wrong.
Zenfor sensed hesitation. Sester was holding something back.
You're right. Even though the coalition is a positive force in this part of the galaxy, my people are held to a higher standard than all its other members. They all look to us for guidance, wisdom, technology, innovation. We learned very young that we are an example to all other races, and we must present ourselves as such. Is that why you're on this ship? She asked. Partially. I wanted to help, but it was also a challenge to see if I could leave Claxia Prime and make a life for myself out here. But it hasn't been without its obstacles. Tell me about it.
He was silent a minute, and she glanced over to his physical form, still operating many of the controls with his long tentacled arms.
There is a credo among my people. Claxians can do no wrong. It isn't a statement of pride or confidence, but instead, it is a warning. It means that we cannot make mistakes, especially in front of other members of the coalition. We hold ourselves to the highest standard, and it is one I have not been able to match.
Zenfor returned her attention to her screens, even though she wanted to reach out for him. It would look strange if she suddenly walked over to him and stood there, staring at him. Everyone would know they were speaking.
That sounds like a difficult standard to uphold.
She couldn't help but think about the camps where she was trained, where Sil stayed there until they finished the training, even if it took years, even if it took a lifetime.
I have made many mistakes since coming aboard. But the funny thing is, some have turned out for the better. How do you mean? You, for instance. Had I not assisted Mr. Rabot in escaping in his own shuttle, it is very possible we never would have established a dialogue with your people, and you would not be aboard.
She couldn't argue with that. She'd been ready to kill Caspian, and it had only been at the insistence of her brother K4 that she allow him to live and hear him out.
I didn't know you helped him escape. Yes. He figured out your ship was the same one he encountered 7 years ago. But he could only do that by illegally downloading information. which I allowed. The captain promised not to tell the sanctuary on the homeworld, but I fear the information will reach them one day.
Another strain of guilt ran through Zenfor. She too had kept information from Moless, specifically that she'd use Silt technology to upgrade Tempest after promising she wouldn't. It was an action punishable by discharge back on Thesleia.
I had no idea you were facing much the same problem, Sester said. I feel like I've betrayed her, like I've betrayed my people. I understand what that means to you. Perhaps, he hesitated again. Yes? Perhaps we can explore our feelings together, and in this way we will no longer each be alone with our mutual problem.
She considered it. She had been terribly lonely since leaving Moless, even though she knew by now she had to be aware of Zenfor's actions. And she would probably not be receptive to Zenfor ever again, especially after she lost her command. And maybe that's what was really bothering her. The fact she knew Moless would abandon her upon her return. And all of Zenfor's actions had done nothing but ensure that outcome. Maybe if the engine upgrade still worked, she could have told herself it was worth it, that they had got something out of it. But now, I think I understand. You need the engines to work in order to justify your betrayal, just like I needed you to come back with Mr. Rabot to justify mine. I suppose that's one way to put it, she replied. I don't want either of us to face that burden alone. Neither did she. It was too hard alone, and she was tired of doing it. She decided right there to never be alone again. 7. This was stupid. He knew this was stupid, and he was on his way to do it anyway. His conversation with Zenfor hadn't given Cass any more confidence as to the state of the engines. With both the undercurrent and Zenfor's enhancements down, there was little chance they'd survive, and the only lead they possibly had was this prisoner with a magical map to treasure and fortune. Fuck. Even thinking it sounded stupid. But he didn't need to commit to anything. Not yet. He was just going to listen to the man's story, and then he'd bring Evie down and let her listen. Then, after a careful evaluation, they'd decide what to do. Cass waved to the security guard who opened the doors to the brig for him, where the alien still sat on a small bench in his room, his knees pressed together, and his entire body tensed up like a spring. Cass felt like he was waiting to launch himself at the barrier itself, but holding back with barely any control. He drew a deep breath. Hello again.
Back for more,
Breed said, his body shaking.
Back for my offer.
First, why don't you tell me how you came to be in this position? How did you get to be a scavenger, borrowing from other people's ships? Breed creased his brow and gritted his sharp teeth.
Not a good story. Sad. Dangerous.
Give it to me anyway. I've got the time. Cass walked over to one of the empty desks in the room, pulling the chair free and setting it down in front of Reach's cell. He took a seat, so he was directly opposite the alien.
Borrowing started when Lack disappeared,
Breach said. Who is Lack? Cass crossed one leg. Breach watched the movement, then mirrored it.
Home. Lack was home, and now it's gone. No more.
Cass huffed. It was like pulling teeth to get anything from the sky. Okay, so you lost your home. How did you get your ship? Where do you dock?
Dock? We're all Bulak dock now. At the hub. Outskirts. I stay out there. Most Bulak aren't friendly to me.
Cass wasn't sure if it was the autovox or if Reach was in fact stuttering. Whatever the cause, it seemed to be getting worse. Okay, so you live on the hub now. Where is that? Breach reached up with one hand held to the sky and undulated his 4 fingers in a rhythm.
Where the supplies are. You can refuel.
Right. Cass uncrossed his leg and crossed the other one. Breach mirrored the movement again. And as soon as we get there, all your friends jump us and take whatever they want. I'm not buying it.
It's the truth,
Reach replied, anxiety coloring the translation of his voice.
You could bargain, barter, trade.
And what could we trade that would be valuable enough to get what we need? Reach looked like he wanted to answer, but instead hesitated. Cass made a motion with his hand. You can go ahead and answer. I know you've already scanned our ship.
Food, medicine. The Bulak have lots of parts, little food.
Cass took a deep breath. Evie wasn't going to like that. They decided to put everyone on rations for a reason. While it was true they had a stockpile of food at the moment, it was designed to get them at least halfway back home. They couldn't barter it away. Not unless Cass was absolutely sure they could fix Zenfor's upgrades with the materials they procured. Because if they could get back using the same system that got them out here, they wouldn't need the food. Okay, let's say the room jolted, throwing Cass from his chair and Reach from his bench, both of them hitting the floor at the same time. Cass hit his comm. Bridge, report.
They're making another run for the ship, Commander,
Uma said on the other end.
Bulak idiots,
Reach muttered, pushing himself up.
Our weapons? Still down, sir. But Ravenkill has 4 space wings out there engaging them right now.
Cass shoved the chair aside. The rest of this could wait until later. If the ship out there realized Tempest didn't have any weapons, they might call in some of their friends. And no number of space wings could help them then. He ran to the door.
Wait,
Reach called, his hand on the barrier separating them. It was meant to provide a mild shock, but Reach held it like it wasn't hurting him at all.
Bulak have fuel cells on the tops of ships. Looks like...
He made a triangular motion with his hand, then extended it out. Fuel cells? Cass asked.
Hit fuel cells, ship's crippled,
Reach said. I'll keep that in mind, thanks, he replied. Cass left the brig and took off down the hall, tapping the back of his hand. Uma, tell Ravenkill to aim for some kind of triangular apparatus on the tops of the ship. They're supposed to be the fuel cells.
Aye, sir,
she replied. I'm on my way. He bypassed the hypervator and ran to the nearest access corridor. Half the hypervators were still out, and there was no sense in him taking one for just one level. He'd already decided in his head he'd avoid them when he could until the ship was back up and at 100%. He scaled the ladders easily and popped out on level 8, finally reaching the bridge. When he arrived, Evie was issuing commands from the captain's chair. Cass took his place beside her.
They're getting bolder. It's 2 ships this time, she said.
Cass took stock of the tactical field before them. It was a straight-on dogfight, and despite their superiority in numbers, the Space Wings were having a hard time keeping up with the Bulak craft.
We got a scan on one of the ships. Its construction is similar to our guests.
Have they managed to hit those fuel cells yet? Cass asked. It was time to see if Reed knew what he was talking about, or not.
Not yet, sir. They've...
A bright flash of light on the screen cut her off. Cass shielded his eyes until the automatic shade turned down the brightness of the screen for a moment before bringing it back up.
What was that?
Evie asked.
Checking now,
Uma replied. I believe it was one of the alien ships, Lieutenant Zoll said in his deep monotone voice. He still hadn't managed to fix his personal apparatus from the attack, and his robotic armature was on complete display for everyone to see, red eyes and all, though he still wore his ceremonial robes.
Fuck yeah! That's what you get, you sons of bitches!
Ravenkill yelled through the comm.
Chief, don't destroy the other one. We need it for...
Another bright flash of light cut Evie off, as the screen went almost white. Ravenkill whooped again.
Sorry, Captain. What was that? I didn't catch that last order. Never mind, Evie replied.
She cut Ravenkill's comm and leaned over to Cass.
I guess I should have told her that before they went out there.
Might have been a good idea, he smirked.
Sir, how did you know about the triangle targets?
Uma asked. Evie looked at Cass in anticipation of the answer as well. It seems our guest wants to put himself in our good graces, he replied. Evie leaned back in her chair.
Awfully convenient, isn't it? He knows exactly how to destroy the one enemy who has been attacking us constantly? What if he wanted to get caught? He's got to be a mole.
Cass shrugged. To be fair, he told me shooting those things would disable the ships, not destroy them. If he was hoping a few more of his friends would be joining him in that brig, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint him.
No,
Evie replied.
I'm tired of hearing about this secondhand. I think it's time I met our illustrious guest and see what he has to say for myself.
Cass nodded. He couldn't think of a better idea. Evie stepped up to the barrier, inches from the edge. The alien on the other side did the same, getting as close as he dared, though Cass told her he'd been able to touch the surface and hold his hand there with little to no indication of pain. She couldn't decide if the plates all over his body protected him in some way, or if he'd just been willing to endure the pain. But it was obvious from his behavior this was a resilient species, and she was struck just how much he resembled some of the Ashkazians. Cass hadn't been lying. There were obvious differences, of course. His eyes were larger, his mouth and chin shapes were different, and the lack of a tail was probably the biggest sign they weren't the same species. But as she stood there watching his small nostrils flare and contract as if he was trying to smell through the barrier, she couldn't help but think they were related in some distant way.
Mr. Reed, it seems your information was helpful, so I want to thank you.
He nodded a few times, but his eyes always came back to Evie's. He wasn't someone who was shy of eye contact.
No more threat?
No more threat, she replied, chancing a glance at Cass. He shrugged.
My friend tells me you know where we can find replacement parts, where we can repair our ship.
Breach nodded.
The hub. Bulak there can help you repair. You can't seriously think I would take my ship into the middle of your people's stronghold, do you? I'd be handing it to them on a platter.
Breach cocked his head.
But your needs are not so dire I'd risk the safety of this entire ship. So, if you were sent here to entice us into delivering a perfectly good spacecraft to your people, your mission has failed.
Breach creased his brow.
I'm not on no mission. Only burrowing to survive, to stay warm. Yeah, I'll buy that when my ship is repaired and my crew is safe,
Evie replied.
But your intel was a little too good. We ended up destroying your friend's ships.
Breach twisted his mouth into a smile.
Good. Serves them right. Stupid Bulak. Waste. Nothing but a waste.
Evie turned to Cass again. Either he was a good actor, or he hadn't cared about the lives of the people on those ships.
Tell me more about this hub. Who would we need to talk to in order to get the supplies we need?
Breach flinched. Evie wondered if Cass caught it too.
Diamant. To talk to Diamant. He controls. He's been there longest. People trust him.
Who is he? Cass asked.
Leader.
Breach flinched again, finally breaking eye contact and cocking his head as if he was hearing a high-pitched noise.
He's the prophet, the one who survived.
Survived? Evie asked.
When Lack was taken from us, Diamant was there, the only one who came back. He's our last connection to the Great Ones.
Evie turned to Cass.
What the hell is he talking about?
I'm not really sure. Either the Autovox is on the fritz, or he's just not making sense. He mentioned that before, though. Lack. Evie returned her attention to their prisoner, catching his eye and keeping it.
Reed, I need you to explain what you're saying. We don't understand. What is Lack? How was it taken? What happened?
Breach really seemed in pain now, but he pressed on anyway.
Lack was our home, our planet. Then they came, destroyed it, destroyed our people. Diamant survived. He was the only one.
Evie stopped.
Wait, someone destroyed your planet?
She exchanged glances with Cass.
Did they also destroy your stars?
Reed's eyes went wide.
How did you know? It seems,
Evie said,
we have a lot to discuss.
8. So now what do we do? Cass asked as they stood outside the brig. Evie couldn't believe it. Reach was from the planet they'd seen destroyed in the long-range telescope sensors. The destruction of his planet had been what had alerted them to the Andromeda threat in the first place. Now she understood why he and his people were scavengers. They'd lost their entire homeworld in the blink of an eye. And then their stars along with it, taking out any other habitable planets in the system. And while this presented them with an opportunity to learn more about the threat, it also put them right in the middle of a desperate people looking for any way to survive.
I'm not sure, she replied. Do you think Sester can spare me a few minutes?
She needed to get her head straight, and the only thing that seemed to work lately was her sessions with Sester. They'd been having them up in one of the cargo bays, but since he'd returned to engineering, they hadn't had the chance. There had been too many crises in the way. Cass shrugged. I'm sure he could spare a few minutes, at least. He's a multitasker. Evie shuddered.
I hate thinking about doing it in front of so many other people. It's hard enough when I'm not being gawked at.
He squeezed her shoulder. Just do what I do when I want to talk to him. Go sit at a console and stare at it, pretending to work. It makes you much less conspicuous. And it isn't like you need to be looking at him while you're in that place, right? She shook her head. He was right. She shouldn't be self-conscious about it. She was the acting captain. She had the prerogative to go and do as she pleased, as long as it didn't endanger the ship. Yes, this was something more of a personal nature, but that didn't mean it wasn't important. And if she needed a clear head in order to make decisions, then so be it.
Get back to the bridge, coordinate with Ravenkel. I want to make sure we're ready in case they pull a surprise attack on us. I'll be there in a few minutes.
Cass nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment. She was about to ask him why when he turned and headed in the opposite direction for the bridge. Evie didn't bother with the hypervator, as engineering was only one level below them, and half of them were still out anyway. But on the climb down through the access corridors, she couldn't help but be reminded of her time on Sisk, into the mines where all the kids played. One of the Simulus species was especially good at echolocation, and often used the mines as a place to hide during games. Evie had still been young, but she wasn't the first child where a combination of eagerness and a desire to be liked led to questionable decisions. She had gone in looking for the other kids, only to become hopelessly lost. It had taken hours for someone to come for her, and she just remembered climbing deeper and deeper into those mines with little to no regard of the consequences or a way out. She shook off the feelings, planting her feet firmly on Deck 10 and making her way down to engineering. Damage control teams littered the decks, attempting to reinforce the existing bulkheads and structures. A few nodded to Evie as she passed. She needed to do right by them until Green was back. She wouldn't let them down, even if she had to take a few more risks than she'd like. Engineering was likewise a mess. More so than last time she'd been in here, which had been right before the life support had failed and she'd had to coax Sester out of his cradle. If they hadn't, they would have lost their chief engineer to suffocation. She felt something like a pressure on her brain and glanced up to see Sester had taken notice of her. A few of the other crew had as well, but most went right back to work. "Captain," Lieutenant Tyler said, looking up from the main control station in the middle of the room. "I wasn't expecting you. Is there something?"
"No. I'm here to see our chief engineer. It's a private matter," she replied.
He nodded. "Of course. Let me know if I can help." She had to hand it to Tyler. When she'd first come aboard, she never would have expected him to make it. He had been so wet behind the ears, and with the added pressure of translating for Sester, she was sure his stress would have broken through before now. But he'd kept his cool during a crisis, and managed to impress them all with his selflessness while engineering was falling apart around them. She was glad he was down here with Sester. Evie made her way around all the smaller stations toward the back, and avoiding the large conduits that ran to the floor and ceiling, which provided the ship with its undercurrent capability. Though she noticed one of the conduits was cracked. It was to be expected with as much stress as they were putting on the ship. As she approached, she noticed Consul Zenfor standing off to the side. She'd been hidden by a consul to where Evie hadn't seen her when she'd first come in. The consul only stared at the information on the screen. Some kind of Syl glyphs, Evie guessed. But the consul wasn't moving. Evie would have been concerned if she hadn't seen the subtle rise and fall of her back.
Consul?
Zenfor blinked a few times, then turned to Evie with a concerned look on her face.
Captain Diazol.
She glanced around the room, then back at her screen.
2 hours. That's concerning.
Are you all right? Evie asked.
Fine.
She glanced up at Sester, then back at her consul again.
I need a break. I'm not making any progress on the engine enhancements.
Evie gave her a sympathetic smile.
You look like you were deep in concentration.
Zenfor glanced to Sester again.
Something like that. The commander and I have begun a formal relationship.
Evie's eyes widened.
We find it mutually beneficial.
That's wonderful, she replied. For once, she was glad the comm towers were down. How was she supposed to include this in a report back to the Coalition? And how would they even react to a Syl becoming involved with one of the founding species? She knew it wouldn't go over well.
You sound upset,
Zenfor said. Evie wasn't about to question this woman's motives. The last thing she needed to do was upset her.
No, just, you know what? It's none of my business. Carry on.
That seemed to satisfy her. She stood, made a curt nod to Evie, and left.
It isn't what you think,
Sester said in her mind. She glanced up at him.
Like I said, it's none of my business. And that's not why I'm here. I need to go back in. Are you sure? It gives me clarity of thought. I'm afraid without it, the hallucinations will start again.
After her final encounter with her father, she'd begun hallucinating during the day and couldn't sleep at night. All that had stopped after she and Sester shared the mind space, and she hadn't had any trouble since. But she'd also had a regular set of meetings with Sester to continue to explore it. This was the longest she'd gone without some kind of experience, and she was afraid of what might happen if she went too long.
Very well. Please take a seat and close your eyes.
Evie did as she was told, taking the seat next to Zenfor's console. This was the part that she always found most nerve-wracking, sitting here, waiting for something to happen. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, waiting for the pull. It was like being yanked through time and space on a tether hooked to a Mark 7 hypershuttle. 1 second she was sitting in engineering, perfectly calm, and the next she was standing in the middle of a nondescript desert, the horizon white in the distance against the gray sky. The ground beneath her feet was dry and cracked, as if this place hadn't seen water in years. In the distance, a figure approached, wearing a standard Coalition uniform. He was completely bald, with no evidence of hair anywhere, and his eyes were as white as the horizon.
Captain,
he said in a soft voice.
Commander,
she replied. This was how it always started. Sester told her the man was her personification of him, if he were human. It might be how her true mind's eye really saw him. She had to admit she found it easier to interact with him this way.
How would you like to begin?
He asked.
I think we can skip the preliminaries.
The scene shifted to them floating in the depths of space. They hadn't traveled there. The desert floor had just vanished in an instant, with the two of them remaining in their places. And even though they were now surrounded by blackness and stars, Sester still had something of an aura to him. A slight glow that was faint and powerful at the same time.
I am glad you're able to exert more control over these visions, he said.
She was too. The first few times, it had been nothing but the same. She'd had to enter her old home on Sisk, encounter the visage of her father, who then transformed into a creature she'd never seen before, but had come to suspect was one of the Andromeda aliens. She didn't know quite why she suspected that, but now that she'd learned about Regis' people, she was anxious to see if she could extract any more information from the vision.
Our new prisoner is a victim of the aliens, she said, still floating. His planet was the one we caught in the long-range telescopes. Then it would be prudent to examine everything we can about what you're seeing, Sester replied.
She nodded. The next part of the vision always followed the first. They were transported to space and then shown a planet Evie had only seen here. It was like no other planet she'd ever seen before, as it was a terrestrial planet, and yet it was massive enough to have rings. The atmosphere, and what she could see of the surface, was green, and 2 small silver moons were locked in orbit. It was beautiful, and also foreboding. She could only assume this was the aliens' homeworld, yet her evidence for such a conclusion was limited at best.
Can you see anything you didn't before? Feel anything? Sester asked.
She closed her eyes and concentrated, trying to focus on the thoughts themselves. Where had these images come from? And why was she always shown the same ones? There had to be a reason for this. Each time before, she'd been distracted by thoughts of her father, as he'd played a prominent role in the first part of the vision. But she'd since learned how to move the sequence back and forth, exert her will over it, and make it show her what she wanted. But nothing else was coming to her. It was just the planet.
I can't. Quiet your thoughts. Try not to think about it too hard, Sester replied. It's not life or death. Just think.
She nodded, opening her eyes again. The planet gleamed like an emerald jewel, and for a moment she thought she saw a shimmer near the twin moons.
There,
she said, pointing at the natural satellites.
I think I saw something.
But just as she concentrated on the shimmer, she and Sester were yanked forward again, down through the planet's atmosphere to the surface, where they stood on a grassy hill overlooking scores of the aliens. They all turned to her in unison, staring with their cold gray eyes.
Damn it,
she muttered. This was the next part of the sequence, the king of the hill, as she called it.
You can take us back. Just focus hard, Sester replied.
She did, thinking back to where they'd just been. The scene changed before them, and they were floating in space once more.
Now focus on what you saw. Take us there.
She nodded, focusing her mind on the moons. Slowly they moved across the reach of space, until they were in front of the moons themselves.
These resemble the moons I saw at Omicron Terminus, she said.
There she'd found 2 moons who had been tidally locked with what seemed to be an ancient arch spanning the distance between them. Was it possible there was an arch here too, but invisible to her?
What do you think? Sester asked. I think there's something here I can't see, and I think it might relate to how these creatures travel, but...
They were yanked forward again, at near undercurrent speeds, until they found themselves in another system. The primary star was a dark blue O-type, while the secondary was a yellow G-type, and the system had 6 planets in orbit. Evie recognized it immediately.
Captain?
Sester said, trepidation in his voice.
I know, she replied. This is all new.
All the other times, after her time on the Green Ring planet, she'd been transported to Omicron Terminus before the sequence started over again. But this was different. She'd seen this system through the sensor telescopes given to them by Starbase 5. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the approaching Armada, all the ships identical to the one they'd seen back at Omicron Terminus. As they passed the 4th planet in the system, a pair of much smaller ships approached from its surface. Before she'd realized it, the Armada had destroyed the smaller ships and turned their attention on the planet. Beams of orange light erupted from the ships and converged into one solid beam, plowing into the planet's core. Within moments, the surface began to crack and break apart, the entire surface of the planet shattering before smaller sections broke off. The molten core, exposed to the vacuum of space for the first time, expanded, then began to fall apart as well. It had taken minutes. Evie caught more ships approaching from other planets in the system, hundreds in fact. This hadn't been on the telescopes. But instead of turning their attention on the smaller ships, the Armada trained their weapons on the O-type star itself, releasing another blast of energy. As soon as their weapons had finished firing, the entire Armada disappeared, while the star itself expanded in an ever-increasing fusion reaction. The result was a supernova that created a shockwave, igniting a similar process in its mate, destroying what few planets remained in the system and wiping out the smaller ships all in one blast. It was a massacre. Evie jerked forward, falling out of the chair. She threw her palms out at the last moment to keep her face from smacking the metal, but as soon as she was stable, she promptly vomited all over the ground. "Captain!" Tyler came running over, along with two of the other engineering crew. Evie wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve. "I'm fine." She held up her hand as she gathered her bearings. The last time she'd seen that massacre, it had been cold and detached from hundreds of thousands of light years away. But this time, it had been much more real, much more visceral, like she'd experienced it in real time. She glanced up at Sester. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know, Captain, but I suggest you take a break. You were under for almost an hour this time." "An hour? Shit." She jumped up, shaking the nausea moving through her like a wave through sand. She checked the chronometer on the closest console. Yep, it was 15 after. She was late for dinner with Laura. "Are you sure you're okay, Captain?" Tyler asked. "I'm fine, Lieutenant," she said, with more heat in her voice than she'd meant. He and the others backed off, returning to their stations. But she couldn't help but feel the eyes of the room on her. "I'll get someone down here to clean this up," she said, indicating the mess on the floor. The last thing she felt like doing at the moment was eating again. But she'd made a promise. "I've already taken care of it," Sester replied. "Take a break, Captain. This was much more intense for both of us this time." She hadn't considered that. Sester had seen everything as well. And if he had a mouth, he'd probably be vomiting all over the place too. But she couldn't worry about that at the moment. She needed to get to her quarters. This wasn't how she wanted this date to start off. "I'll be back later, and we can try again," she said. Sester didn't reply in her mind, but she couldn't help but think he was fine with it. One thing was for sure. Breach's people were in dire straits, which could either make them the perfect allies or very dangerous, and she was going to have to decide which. She only hoped she made the right choice. 9. Evie stirred, groaning at the headache that had permeated her dreams and sustained itself until she was fully conscious. She knew it was going to be a bad one, and she'd have to make a trip by sickbay before hitting the bridge this morning, even though sickbay was the last place she wanted to be. Despite her own personal bad memories of being there, she didn't like being so close to the captain's unconscious body. It was creepy, but why she couldn't say. She rolled over, reaching out and feeling the cold sheets next to her. Even though she'd been expecting it, the lack of someone else there left a pit in her stomach. Laura had tried to hide her disappointment the evening before, but Evie could still tell she'd been hurt, even though she said she understood. And it didn't help Evie hadn't stopped going on about the visions and what they might mean, and what they should do about them. Had she even asked Laura about her day? How she was feeling? She groaned again in frustration. She'd screwed up big time, and she'd need to find a way to make amends for it. She dragged herself out of bed, her head pounding, and took a quick shower, just enough for a quick rinse, before getting dressed and ready for the day. She still wasn't used to the captain's stripes on her uniform, and only hoped things would go back to normal in a few days. Weeks if necessary. She couldn't be in charge and still deal with these visions at the same time. In fact, she probably needed to get back down to engineering again to go through it all the second time. But there just wasn't any time today. And that was another thing. Before, all their sessions had lasted maybe 15 minutes at the longest. But this one had been over an hour. Had Sester not noticed the passage of time either? Had they both been stuck in there in some kind of limbo while the rest of the ship had moved on without them? She couldn't be sure, but she didn't like the thought of being lost in the mind space forever. Next time, she'd need to ask Sester to set a timer, or get someone else to wake them up. Zenfor, perhaps. Evie chuckled at the implications. Sester and Zenfor. Who would have thought? Though it made sense. They were both alone on this ship, both having left their homes to help the Coalition, both unique among all the other races on board. But she suspected it was deeper than that. A shared kinship over something she didn't quite understand. And that was fine. She was just glad she wasn't the one who had to write the report on it. Green would be floored when he woke up. As she left, she took a glance at the sword hanging on her wall, the constant reminder that she was better than her father ever had been, and that she was worthy to keep such an old family heirloom. At one time, she'd found it something to be ashamed of, but not anymore. Now it was hers, and vice versa. She planned on being buried with that sword. Sickbay was quiet this morning, as it was still early. The third shift hadn't yet finished, and first shift was just gearing up, so most of the people she passed were preparing for their days. And when she entered the medical ward, she was grateful to see all the other patients had finally been discharged. "Good morning, Captain," Box said, approaching. "May I ask how your sex life is going?" "No, you may not," Evie replied, not missing a beat. She'd gotten used to him over the past few weeks, and despite assurances from Zax he was getting better with his inappropriate comments, Evie hadn't seen a difference. Perhaps Zax had given up. Or more likely, Box was only behaving when the doctor was around. "I need something for a headache." "How bad? On a scale of, I ate something spicy, to my eyeballs are going to burst into a gooey mess." "Somewhere in the middle," she replied. "You got it." He walked over to the far wall, programming something into the computer. "Have you made a decision on the prisoner yet?" Evie furrowed her brow. "Let me guess. Cass told you." "He was in here drinking again last night. I had to keep him entertained until it got out of his system." Evie's shoulders fell. Damn it. She had really thought he'd given that up, at least while they were dealing with all these emergencies. "Oh," Box said, returning with a small pill in his hand. "I'm sorry. That was cruel. He wasn't drinking. But he did tell me about the guy. He sounds weird." She sighed, exasperated. "We're all weird. Was he drinking or not?" She took the pill and swallowed it without any water. "No, I was just disparaging his character. It's a hobby of mine." "That's not very nice." "I'd say I won't do it again, but we both know I will. What if I went with something less destructive, but completely within his capability? Passing gas, for instance. He could have been in here farting up a storm. You never know." Box stared at her with his bright yellow eyes. They weren't blinking today. "So, did you decide?" "It's classified," she replied. "Fine. Don't tell me. I'll find out from him later anyway." Evie rolled her eyes as Box returned to his duties. "I don't need to know. I only single-handedly saved everyone on the ship." She knew he was baiting her, but she couldn't help it. "How?" "When engineering was about to collapse, I stood guard and made sure everyone got out in time. It was the struggle of my life, holding those bulkheads back. They could have buckled at any moment. It was only by my infinite determination that I was able to succeed." "You stood beside the door and watched people leave," she replied, deadpan. Box turned to her. "Agree to disagree. I'm a hero." Something clicked inside his head. "I think he's brilliant." "Is that Commander Wolf's voice?" Evie asked, approaching him. "Yep, her first words to me. I recorded them for posterity." Evie couldn't help but laugh. "Of course he did." "Do you ever make recordings of anything I say?" she asked. He hesitated 2 beats too long. "No." "Box?" "No," with an asterisk. "Delete them right now." His eyes blinked like wild. "But they're for my research. I'm going to write a medical journal on the mating patterns of all Coalition species. It'll be a compendium like no other. I need first-hand corroborations." "Get them from someone else," she replied. "Ah, fine. You're getting to be just like him. I thought you were cool." "Cool doesn't mix well with running this ship." She glanced over to the other side of sickbay, behind which the captain's body still lay. "Has there been any change?" He shook his head. "Doc hasn't begun her procedure yet. She scheduled it to begin later this afternoon.
Let me know how it goes, will you?
I will, he replied. She left them there, heading to the bridge. Fox might be a pain in the ass, but he was a good soul underneath, or whatever the robot equivalent was. Coalition Central still hadn't come up with a classification for him when they lost contact, though Evie imagined it was probably low on their list of priorities, what with the impending armada on their doorstep. She only hoped they could get back home in time to share what little they knew. Although, with this new information from Vreej, they might be able to discover even more. But that wasn't the priority at the moment. Only if it was convenient. What had he said? This Diamant had survived the destruction of their homeworld? After witnessing the destruction firsthand in her visions, Evie wasn't sure how that was possible. But maybe it was worth investigating, at least with a small contingent of officers. Evie stepped off the hypervator on the bridge to find Cass already at his posting, as the rest of third shift was taking their leave and first was coming on. Laura took up tactical from Lieutenant Stillwater, but only shot a quick look at Evie before turning back to her duties. Yep, she was pissed, and Evie couldn't blame her. No wonder she went back to her own quarters last night. She needed to apologize, but she wasn't going to do it here. It needed to be somewhere more private. Cass, in the command room, she said, bypassing her seat and making her way for the door adjacent the bridge. Inside, she took her seat behind the desk, while Cass took the one opposite her.
Any further thoughts about our opportunity?
I still think it's worth the risk. We're due for another attack in under 3 hours, and we're still not completely recovered from the last one. Though I think having Raffenkill out there helped a lot. They managed to get half the weapon systems back online overnight, but there's no telling if they'll hold. We could make it through another fight, and the relays could blow again, leaving us right in the same place where we were. We can't keep going like this. She sighed. He was right. She'd really hoped Green would have woken up before now. He'd know what to do. No matter what, he always had a plan. There's something else, he added. When I got on the bridge, I overheard Commander Wolf saying something about you. I didn't catch all of it, because she stopped as soon as she saw me, but I heard your name and a few other choice words I won't repeat. She couldn't say she was surprised. After their tiff on the shuttle and Evie's dressing down of her publicly on the bridge as they were trying to escape the minefield, she'd felt like Wolf had it in for her ever since.
I don't care about that, she lied. If she has a problem with me, she needs to bring it to me in private, not gossip on the bridge. And you need to call that behavior out when she does.
I almost did, he began. She sensed a lot of hesitation there. What was going on with him? Usually he didn't have trouble confronting people. She waved it off. They had bigger issues.
My experience with Sester last night was illuminating. I think the Bulak could be good candidates for allies, but only if they can show they can control themselves. We need these attacks to stop.
Cass leaned forward. Agreed. And we'll need to establish some ground rules with them before we agree to anything. If Reach is telling the truth, and this friend of his really survived that attack, we need to know everything he knows. It could be more important than the supplies themselves.
Not if we can't do anything with the information. Either we find a way to transmit it back, or we fix the engines so we can return home. That's priority 1. Priority 2 will be to gather information about the threat from this Diamant or whoever he is. Get with Raffenkill and take a shuttle to this hub. See what they're offering. Then we'll take the next steps.
He nodded. What changed your mind? She drew a deep breath.
A lot of things. We need to find a way to survive out here, and it's obvious we can't do it alone. But we also can't be stupid about this. I'm not thrilled about taking this step, but maybe Vreej was a happy accident instead of saboteur.
He eyed her. You don't really believe that, do you?
It doesn't matter what I believe. It's what is best for the ship.
He nodded. Okay, I'll get right on it. Anything else? He asked, standing. She smirked.
Yeah. Try not to get yourself captured or killed. We're short on personnel as it is.